Hi, everybody. This is the last in our series of RBM webinars for monitors, and I'm a little bit sad. I've really enjoyed communicating with many of you about risk-based monitoring and have gotten such great feedback on these webinars. So I just want to say thank you for those of you who have come many, many times, and for those of you who are new, please go to our YouTube channel and you can catch up. We will continue to add content to the YouTube channel, so if you subscribe, you'll know. As I go through talking to people about risk-based monitoring, I will be doing short videos on questions that people ask that I'm getting continually so that we can kind of start to get the message out and people can understand more about risk-based monitoring, and you as the champions for risk-based monitoring in your organizations will have more information that you can use. So continue to email me anytime that you want to. I'm here to help, and I'm eager to be supportive however I can be in your adoption of risk-based monitoring. So let's get started. So just a brief introduction, MANA RBM has been focusing on both the principles of risk-based monitoring and remote trial management for more than 10 years. I have done just about every job in clinical research in one way or another, as well as being a physician, and my team members have implemented risk-based monitoring for multiple sponsors in multiple size trials, and as well as completing a knowledge transfer. So we also are committed to helping the industry to advance risk-based monitoring, which is why we worked with a group of experts to do the competencies for site monitors, as well as to publish in a number of different areas. We have a publication coming out in Applied Clinical Trials in their ebook on kind of the people aspects of risk-based monitoring, and in June we'll have one coming out on technology implications of risk-based monitoring. So keep your eye out for that, as well as additional publications that we do. So we'll send notes out, we'll put that in our blog, so you'll be able to keep up on new things that we've found, or things that we think are great for you to follow from other people, of course. So as you know, if you've missed any of our webinars, they're all on MANA risk-based monitoring under YouTube. And if don't go to the individual webinars, but just go to the very top thing. If you do MANA risk-based monitoring on YouTube, the very first one will be our channel, and you'll be able to get all of the webinars there. And as you subscribe, you do get a notification as we add new things. Also, if you like us on Facebook, then you'll get updates that we post on our blogs, like the meeting that we're going to be at next week for the clinical informatics best practices. If you're going to be at the MedRio conference, we're going to be talking about how we develop the site level forms to help us with risk-based monitoring. That meeting is in March. And I'm also going to be at the outsourcing conference for the Southeast, which is in Raleigh. I think it's March 15th and 16th. So for more information, come to our website. The links are there if you want more information. And also, don't hesitate to just email us, because we're happy to help any way we can. So just as a reminder, the overall goal here is to help all of you understand the principles of risk-based monitoring, the goals, and how to achieve those goals. So lots of people talk about kind of the theory, and what we're trying to do is help you to really focus on implementation, because for me, it's all about getting it done. Now, for today, what we want to do is to focus on how to evaluate site performance data, to describe the key data needed to interpret site performance data. So this is kind of a compilation and an area. The reason I wanted to really focus on this is there's a lot of companies trying to sell tools for this. And so I want to try to give you some some of our experience there to really help you to think about that. So, first of all, there is no magic bullet. So, a lot of times I get approached by people and they'll say to me, "Oh, I just want a report that'll tell me where to go and what I should do." And I tell them, I wish it could be that simple. So what you get are indications. What we do is, and one of the other things to know about a lot of these fancy tools you have is that the systems are set up to make them look wonderful, but there's a lot of work to make that happen, and that may or may not be the right tool for you. So I've seen many very beautiful data visualizations, but when I start to ask the questions about how can I drill down in the data, how can I modify certain data that I need, how can I do ad hoc reports, all of the things that you really need to do to really not just see that you have a signal, but understand what you need to do with it, that many of those systems don't have that capability. So beware of pretty pictures. And remember that there is no one way to do it, and there is no one easy answer that's going to tell you exactly what you need in one report. So the other thing that I want to, I laughed about this. You know, one of the things that so this little guy, this doctor is saying, you know, offhand, I see you're suffering from an arrow through your head, but just to play it safe, I'm ordering a bunch of tests. And when I was in medical training, you know, one of the things they taught us is, you know, yes, you may see a bullet someplace, or you may see pneumonia, but you have to remember to look at everything else around it, because what you may be seeing is just a symptom of a bigger issue. And so even though this seems like a stupid thing to do, to think about, oh, I see the arrow in your head, but think about it, that what you may be seeing is only the tip of the iceberg. So you want to be able to look more thoroughly, more comprehensively. And so one of the case studies I'm going to show you at the end, you'll see that you may get one signal, but there may be other signals there that you need to understand and identify. So it's really important not just to jump on the first thing, but to really thoroughly evaluate it. But those triggers are important and they are helpful. So we do want to be able to look at kind of overall performance to help us figure out where there are issues. But remember, it's not going to be as easy as, oh, here's something, send somebody out to the site. Let's figure out more what we can do. So just as a reminder, and for any of you that are new, we're not talking about the review at the individual subject level. Okay? This work is going to be done, but some of the output of that work is going to be used to do this overall site performance data. Now, we did have a whole session on central monitoring, and site performance data is just a component of central monitoring. Excuse me. As we mentioned, central monitoring is looking at trending, it's looking at closing issues. It's a much bigger job than just site performance data. But I thought it was really important because so often that question is asked to me, that we can see how could you set up kind of an overview of the site performance data that could be a little bit of an early warning signal to you. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But we still need this. So remember, you're not going to get some of the information you need unless people are doing this work. So you can't do this in isolation. And that's important to remember. So if we talk about, this is kind of the pathway that you need to go. One is to perform that standard assessment, and that's what we're talking about today, that site performance data. But once you've done that, once you've identified those outliers, then you need to look for other evidence in those outlier areas and maybe other areas. So what you're finding is, oh, this is somebody I knew, this is a site I need to look at more thoroughly. This is an area that I need to look at more thoroughly. So you're going to want to look for all other evidence. Remember, perform those other tests, Don't start with just the arrow in the head, and then determine what that intervention is going to be. Does it need to be remote, or I mean, can it be remote before you do on-site? And depending on what it is, sometimes you can still do a lot of that assessment and intervention remotely. So again, it depends on what the issue is, but remember, this is just a kind of early warning signal for you. Excuse me. Now, what I tried to do here is to help you think about how to think about kind of chunks of or areas that you might want to look at. Okay, and I'm just giving you some examples. It may be different depending on the phase of the study that you're in. It may be different. It will certainly be different from depending on the trial, but these are kind of the overall physical, if you will. I like to think of it in the physical exam standpoint. These are the basic checks that you want to do on all of your data. And again, you may want to add some additional ones as well, depending on your programs, etc. So I think of operations. Some of the things you're going to want to look at is your site startup data, your enrollment data, your screen failure data. And we're going to go through each of these in more detail. From a safety standpoint, you're going to have you want to want certain metrics. And you notice that I put early terms under safety metrics, and that's really because that's the way the safety reviewers look at it. So I want you to be thinking about the data the way the safety reviewers are going to look at it, and the way what signals they're going to look at. And remember, when we talked about the audit group, these are fields that they want to look at. So you want to look at those people that are outliers there, because that's going to be critical importance. Now, from a data quality standpoint, some of the ones that you're going to want to look at are time to data entry, your queries, and your deviations. From a GCP standpoint, now this is one you probably wouldn't normally get, but informed consent errors, your training documentation, your delegation of authority. Again, these are indicators from a documentation standpoint. And finally, remember, with risk-based monitoring, one of the most important areas is investigational product management. So if you think about it, what we're looking at when we talk from the very beginning, talking about risk-based monitoring, we've talked about we want to look at safety, excuse me, we want to look at data quality, we want to look at GCP, we want to look at investigational product, and we don't necessarily say operations, but we want to look at how the trial is conducted. And remember, this assumes that Tier 1 and Tier 2 review have already happened. So let's look at the operations first. So I want to talk a little bit about metrics, because I think a lot of times when we talk about metrics, people close their ears and go, I don't want to hear about numbers, but we all want to hear about numbers, and let me show you why. So site startup is kind of your first date, if you will, with the sites, your first indication of what site performance is going to be. So you're going to want to look at things like the quality of the documents being provided. How many times did you have to review that? And the responsiveness of the site. You're going to want to look at the workflow and capture of data on each step, and I'll explain to you why. So you want to know, and these are things people collect in a pre-study visit all the time. What's the expected duration for IRB approval, for contracts? Who are the key people? So this isn't really any different. But what's different is capturing the metrics with that. Excuse me, I have a cold today. And if there's no system to capture this data, remember, you always have, you could do a form in the site level forms like we've developed, or you can capture that in something as simple as Excel. So there's no reason not to capture that data. So what we want to do is figure out, though, remember we went at the very beginning of these presentations, we started talking about you're going to identify risk and you're going to figure out how are you going to be able to look at that? What's the data that's going to allow you to be able to do the assessment that you need to do? Same way here. How are you going to know if you have if something's taking too long. And I can't tell you how many times I have had companies tell me that this is a real problem for them. And let me tell you why. So this is often the kind, as a project manager, that may be the kind of report that you're going to get. Okay, this site has the CDA signed and the contract signed, but you don't have the 1572 and you don't have your IRB submission complete. This one has the 1572, but you don't have the IRB submission complete. So you can see, I know what's been done, and this is, like I said, what you usually get. But if you collect your data in a different way, you can say, when was that CDA actually submitted? When was it signed? And how many days did it take me? Same way with the contract. Here's the time I submitted it. Here's the time it's complete. How long did that take me? So if you have this calculated for you, and you can only do it if you've captured these dates, then those outliers become much easier to see. Just like we talked about with the SPAR and trying to compare dates and durations and all of that, it's very difficult to do when you're looking at dates. But when you can make this in a way that allows you to either normalize it or to have something like a elapsed day that tells you, hey, this site has taken 153 days to get their contract. That tells you, oh, I need to do something. And you can, in fact, set these triggers to be, oh, if something is over a certain duration, this now goes into the red zone. So these things can be done in Excel, that's true, or you can set them up, as we said, in special reports. But the bottom line is you want to collect these metrics because not only are they going to help you with this study, but if you're doing a program, this helps you as data that can support selecting sites, managing expectations. Let's just say this is a key opinion leader site and they say, oh, we got to have that site anyway. You can say, okay, that's fine, but it's going to be probably 6 months to get their contract. And as long as you're okay with that, we're okay with that. But it's all about managing expectations, knowing whether you have an issue and how to follow up on that issue. So as I go back over and over and over again, it's about data, and data is not a dirty word. Now, what does the added data tell you and not tell you? So like if you saw a single delay, that may be nothing. But if you began to see that a site's performance was longer than the other sites across multiple of these, let's just say you had to submit the 1572 4 times during startup because they put the wrong, all the reasons, they didn't include everything they needed to. They didn't have some of the data accurate. They didn't include people. Excuse me. What that tells you is either maybe they don't have enough staff, or there are other support problems at the site, or maybe that you have lack of involvement with the PI. So these little clues are really going to help you to know, okay, maybe I need to watch this site. I don't know that I would change a risk indicator at this point for those sites, but I would clearly say, oh, this site is taking longer on everything. Let's keep a closer eye on them. So if you see multiple delays that they may not have a good attention to detail, and again, that's a risk for your study quality. And that's what you want to be doing is you're all about study quality. So now let's look at some of the operational data. And part of this is just to kind of remind you as you're trying to set this up. So if we're going to evaluate enrollment and randomization, and just so that we're clear here, I think of enrollment as you've signed the informed consent. And so everybody enrolls because they all sign the informed consent, and then they're either randomized or screen failure. Now, every study is a little bit different, so that may not be the case, but that's, to me, if you sign an informed consent, you're enrolled in the study. And again, you can have a screening phase or whatever, but just so that we're on the same page, what I'm talking about in here, that's what I'm talking about. So if you see a high screen failure rate, what does that mean? Your answer should be, I don't know, because I have to look at it in the context of how many subjects were randomized at that site. So if they randomized a lot of subjects, then they will have more screen failures than, say, somebody that only randomized 2 or 3. So this is probably one of my really important take-homes to you. Normalize the data, normalize the data. So your screen failures should be looked at in the context of the number of subjects randomized so that you can compare across different sites. Now, the other piece that you need to think about is you want to review data over time. A lot of times, even from project meetings or whatever, you get the data at that time point, but you're not really often given that data to look at over over months, over a period of time, so that you can look at what happens. Because everybody can, the investigator may have had to go to may have been on service, the investigator may have gone to a meeting. So you want to look at everything not as an individual time point, but as a total picture. This also allows you to identify persistent problems. So is this blip something? Let's wait and see. Are we seeing it over time? And it also allows you to do other things. So let's look at things like effectiveness of advertising campaigns. So if we look at this and remember, so I've normalized the data. It's the number of screen failures divided by the number of subjects randomized. And this one was done a little bit differently. We did it at month 3, month 6, and month 9, just to give you a chance to look at it. And you can see here that, what you're seeing here is a gradual increase. Here they went down, but they're moving up the way they need to. But here you can see they have many more screen failures. So if you have a hard time, and I often have to kind of go back to kind of a simple example. So if I say, is it good or bad to have a high number here? And so if you say, if I had 1 screen failure and 1 patient randomized, my number would be 1. If I had 2 screen failures to 1 person randomized, my number would be 2. If I had 3 subjects screen failure to 1 subject randomized, my number would be 3. So what you're seeing here is that this site is having many more screen failures than number of subjects randomized. And this seems to be getting worse. So for me, what I'm saying is, I need to look at this site because they had an issue at the beginning. Okay, that could be, just learning the protocol seemed to get better and now they're having a real issue. So now this is a trigger for me. And remember, if you can't figure out, do I want a high number or a low number, take a really simple example and work through it, and you'll begin to figure out what these ratios mean. You don't have to know them right away. I never do. I just figure them out at the beginning when I go through it to say what's really important to me. Now let's look at another example. And again, this is looking at data by month. And so what we have here is we have the number of subjects here, and we have the sites, and then we have, let me show you here. And then what we have here is January, February, March, April, May, and June. So these are the data for each site. So part of it is you got to look at, remember we talked about, you got to look at the legend. You got to look at on both sides. So this is for site 1, site 2, site 3, site 4, okay? And then what we saw here is then there was a period of time when they had the advertising. So the advertising took place in that May-June timeframe. So you can see here that this peak was where the advertising took place. So a couple of things that and then here on the end, I put the projected, okay? So this could say, all right, we were expecting you to enroll 5 subjects per month for the study. So now I can see what the projected is. If they had done it on the projected, they'd have 30 subjects enrolled. So I can first go through and see, okay, most of these sites are doing pretty well. They're at or above what they should be for enrollment, except for 2. Right here and right here. So the first thing this does is it lets me look at everybody's performance. It lets me look at them in comparison. I can look at them by month, so it's a really nice way to look at it. And I can see where my problem sites are. The other neat thing is I can look at the effect that May, June advertising did and what it did to each site's enrollment. So I can see, was it effective or not? So all of these things really help you to begin to assess whether certain advertising campaigns worked, whether which sites are going to be problematic. And the other thing that these are telling you is that they've been problematic throughout. So this is something that's not just a 1 month thing, but it's been a series. So there's a lot that these data can tell you, and sometimes you're going to have to look at the data in a couple of different ways to be able to see what that data is going to tell you. Because, for instance, I said advertising was in May, June. So that means these sites, 2 and 3, 6 and 8, they really didn't get a lot of benefit from the advertising. But this site, wow, they got a lot of benefit from the advertising. So for them, you can use these kinds of things to see, why was that? Did they have somebody that was ready to answer the phone when the call center called? What did they do? So remember, it's not always bad. It's sometimes we want to learn from the sites that were very effective. So site 8 really got a lot of boost from this. Site 2, not so much. So what was different with these? Because our whole goal is, how do we make the study successful? And so we want to be able to look at this data that way. So remember, if you only look at one time point, you're not able to get that total picture, and you're not able to kind of relate it to other things. So you want to be thinking about this data and comparing it across sites, but also over time. Now, what do the signs tell us? Well, when I see a high screen failure rate, I'm thinking a couple of things. There may be more, but I'm always thinking, did that staff understand the protocol? Are they just calling everyone in? In fact, do they get paid for every screen failure? And their goal is, well, we're going to make as much money as we can because we're going to bring everybody we know in, whether they meet the criteria or not, just so that we can get more money for our screen fails? Or is it inadequate understanding, or is there some other reason? So these are like little warning flags for you to look at. Poor metrics on site startup. So these are your little warning flags that you want to look at. Is the site understaffed? Okay. Or do the staff that are responsible for doing documentation have poor attention to detail? If they do, it may not be just the 1572 that they're having a poor attention to detail. It may be the informed consents. It may be your other documentation on investigational product. So again, these kind of overview reports can give you some places to begin to look for what's the underlying cause. And that's really, we like the signs, and that's what these site reports do, but we really want to get to what the underlying cause is and how else will that be affected. So let's look at safety. So I put some little red flags here so that you know that when I see these things, I'm thinking big time red flags. So they are not just, oh, that's interesting, but I need to really pay attention to that. So we want to look at what are the SAE rates across sites. And remember, you're going to do your SAE rate, excuse me, will vary depending on whether you're looking at a long-term study or short-term study, but you want to normalize that data based on the number of subjects that are treated or the duration of treatment. So this is important here. But are there deviations for SAE reporting? And that's why I'm going to come back over and over and over again to the question of deviations. So are there deviations for SAE reporting? Big red flag, because that's saying they're not following a basic rule that has been hammered into everybody's head from the very beginning. And are there SAEs that were not reported during until a monitoring visit? Another big red flag. So as we talk about, we like to do a lot of this remotely, but there need to be monitoring visits in most studies. And the really important thing that monitor is doing is making sure that the site has done all of the reporting they need to around safety, and investigational product, etc. So this is a critical thing that monitors need to do when they go out to the site, checking records, etc. And so if there is an SAE that they didn't report it, red flag automatically. Now you need to look further into the performance of that site. Now let's look at some more, let's look at another category. So we looked at SAEs, now let's look at AEs. So AE ascertainment. So again, just like we talked about with the SAEs, if there's SAEs that weren't identified until a monitor went to the site, the same way, are there AEs? So is this site not doing a good job in pulling the AEs? That's a really, really important thing. So because if that's the case, then you are going to probably have to go out to the site more often. And the only way you're going to know that is to be able to collect this rate and to be able to look at this. And the reason I bring this up is because you need to know where you're going to be able to capture this. So if you use sticky notes to put on a piece of paper source and say this should be entered into the AEs, you have no way to know that the site didn't enter that until the monitor went out to the site. So you may want to make this a field. Were there AEs that weren't captured in the EDC system until the monitor went out to the site? Again, it's these little things that you say, I need to know this. How am I going to find it out? So today we're talking not only about what can you use, but how are you going to figure out where you're going to get that data? Again, AE rates. We talked about that you want to normalize that based on the number of subjects enrolled at the very least. And depending on whether it's a long-term study, you may want to use the number of treatment days because you want to be able to compare the data across sites and they're not going to be exactly the same. Now, a lot of times, excuse me, we are looking at the high rates. And, we talked about a little bit when we looked at Z-scores that sometimes you want to look at the low rate. And this is one of the places where the lowest and the highest are important to review. Because the lowest rates may say that they're not adequately reporting, okay? So you want to make sure that you're really thinking, not just focusing on those that are reporting at the highest, but also those that are at the lowest. And are the rates similar across sites and across regions? And this is important. Those of you that do international studies know that there are regional differences in the way AEs are reported. And so you may want to be able to compare AE rates within a region as well as across all of your study site to be able to think about those things and recognize those things. Are the rates of lab AEs similar? You would expect that, but so this is one of the things to think about is a special kind of AE. And what about the rates of AEs of special interest? So, oftentimes once you get to phase 3, there are specific AEs that are important for that development program to better understand. And so you may want to look at those separately than the rate of all the AEs. And then once you've looked at this, remember, this is your signal. This is your kind of early warning signal. Then you want to go in and look more about the distribution of the AEs and much more into the details. So this is your early warning signal. Now you're going to dive into the data and look at it and understand it better. And again, as I mentioned, I put premature discontinuation in here as a red flag because this is used by safety reviewers. It is an important thing because what this is really saying, why are these subjects not staying in this study? So you do want to normalize the data to be able to compare it across sites, which for this one, you would clearly normalize this data based on the subjects that were randomized to the study because the screen failures are already out. And you want to look at those sites with the highest level. So if you have a low rate of premature discontinuation, awesome. What you want to do is you want to look at those with the higher rates and figure out why. So, and you also want to look, are a lot of those discontinuation rates due to sites with a lot of loss to follow-up, a lot of intercurrent illness or withdrawn consent? Again, triggers from a safety standpoint. So, as I said, I put premature discontinuation in safety. You might put it in ops. It's fine. As long as you're looking at it, doesn't really matter. Just recognize where you are going to look at it. But this is a really important one. And finding out the reason why subjects discontinued is really important as well. Now let's look at data quality. Remember, so time to data entry. All right. So again, depending on your study, we've gone through this in previous webinars. The sites, we want those sites that are outside the expected range. And remember, we want those on the high side. And there's a number of reasons. One is sites with the longest entry time for that present the greatest risk for subjects. Longest time to entry means they are, they may not be able to answer questions as to certain information that happened during the subject visit. So, and as I mentioned in a DIA presentation that I was in a couple years ago, one of the sponsors found this was their best quality indicator. So don't forget to look at it. And it's a simple one. Remember, you have a time to data entry for every single form. So you may want to say, do I want to look at 3 or 4 different forms? And sometimes your time to data entry will be prolonged. So let's think about, excuse me, during a screening visit, if you have to wait to get labs to be able to fill certain information in from a visit, that's going to take longer. So you want to use your knowledge of the protocol to help you figure that out. So certain pages may take longer because you have to get certain information from a third-party reviewer, from a reading from a chest x-ray or a central reading from an ECG or whatever. So you want to think about what would be the forms that are most representative. Demographics, that should be done right away. Vital sign, demographics, vital signs, those kinds of things. That data should be entered right away. So those are also helpful for you to look at. Now, queries, and I think we talk about queries a lot. So we talk about in a traditional trial, you're always seeing how many queries are open, how many queries have been responded to, how many queries are closed. You're always looking at trying to clean that data, okay? We also talked about when we were looking at trending that we didn't care so much about how many, we wanted to look at the total number of queries on a question-by-question basis, because that told us, were some of the questions wrong, and by site basis, because we wanted to look at whether a certain site was having trouble with certain questions, but other sites weren't. So queries really tell us a lot of information, and it's not just how many open. We also want to look at the rate. So we want to look at the sites with the highest query rate. And again, you want to normalize that data, because if you only have 10 queries, but you only have 1 subject, that's a lot different than 10 queries and 100 subjects. So we want to remember to think about that query rate and also query response time. So those sites that have the longest response time, oftentimes we find that that's because they don't answer the queries, or, as many of you know this so painfully, they'll say, oh, we addressed it and fixed it, but when you go back to check, they didn't. So sometimes you have to go back in and requery. So if your system has the ability to look at the requery, that's a really good opportunity. And if not, you want to look at how long did it take them to respond, and then how long did it take them to close? And remember, that's not just the site, but also the monitor or data manager. The idea is you're looking at queries in many different ways, and many ways that you traditionally didn't look at queries when you were doing traditional data review. So these are the things that are going to be important to you to help you from a data quality standpoint. And then we've talked about this several times too, to clean data. So how are you going to capture this? And so I say this over and over again, so hopefully this will sink in, that the issue log is one way. So, if you have a lack of expected variability, data variability that we found, say, by doing our cross-subject visits analysis, which is part of our Tier 3 review, then how is that going to be captured? Is that going to be captured? To me, I think one of the best places would do it would be in the issue log. But the big point is for you to think about if you had that, how would you know? So that you can because this is another important data quality aspect that we've talked about. And the really important thing is you're looking at site performances. Where would you find that out if it happened? And then you could begin to look at that. So this is not something that you might look at on a subject by subject basis, but in the overall picture of data quality, it's absolutely critical. So remember, just because that happens, you've got to be able to find some place to know if that's happened. Now, deviations. Deviations to me are the absolutely one of the most important things for you to really have as quickly as possible, as regularly as possible. So I have worked with companies who didn't do deviations, that didn't really define the deviations to the end of the study, and that's a really dangerous approach. So what I am encouraging you to do is make sure that that process of capturing those deviations, whether you're doing it within your EDC system, whether you're doing it as a separate Excel spreadsheet, I don't care. The important thing is the deviations really tell you the most about data quality and protocol compliance. Because remember, deviations are by definition when the site did not follow the protocol or GCP. So they are like your big red flag. So who has the most deviations? Remember, we're going to look at deviations in a lot of different breakdowns. So we're going to look at deviations by classification of deviation, whether it's a missing visit, whether it's missing assessments. So when you're doing your cross-site evaluation, you may want to look at not just the total number of deviations, but deviations by class. So, for instance, a study which you might have a study where the sponsor would not, they had a very narrow window, let's say, to contact a subject for follow-up. So they only had maybe 3 days. And then, so you had a lot of deviations in that area. That may be one thing, and you may look at those and go, oh, this is the evidence that says we need to change our protocol because look how many deviations we're getting in this area. Again, that's more trending, but you're looking at it across site and seeing it. Every site is having a lot of deviations in this area. If you're talking about an area of missed assessments, or you're talking about not following the protocol, those are, and maybe in different ways, those are your red flags. And so by not only just looking at deviations, but the classifications by site over time is a really, really important data quality marker. So remember this one, make sure you look at it, and make sure that that you have a way to capture this. It's like everything else we talk about, even if you do it on Excel. Now, we always include a deviation form for each subject, a repeating form so that we can capture that for each subject. And then we also have a separate deviation that we have in our site level forms to collect the deviations for that are not subject specific, that are site specific. Investigational product management, whether it's training, whether it's whatever it might be. These are the things that you're catching. So remember, if you only capture the deviations at the subject level, you may be missing some very important deviations. So just something to think about. I had one group told me about a site had used the wrong investigational product. They had 2 studies going, and they used the investigational product from one study for another study. Now, that was across all the subjects, but if you had a way to capture that at a site level, you would be able to identify that very quickly. So that's another opportunity for you to look at those deviations. Now, this one, I think, so often we are very data driven, but it's usually analysis data that we're driven on. And I am making a plea for us to be much more focused on things in documentation as well. And one of the most important areas in documentation is around informed consent. So one of the things that you want to do is you want to look at what's your rate of informed consent errors. So again, we'll go back to the same question I asked you from the very beginning. How are you going to collect this? So one way you can do this is to raise a query within the EDC on the informed consent date or whatever to say subject, documentation was not adequate on the informed consent form. Please clarify. It is not an EDC, it's not a data issue, but it allows you to capture that information. Otherwise, you may have to go to a spreadsheet or some other way that an issue log would be another way. So regardless, remember that just finding errors and getting the site to correct them, this is a really, really important metric. And we know it's in the top 5 areas for audit findings. We know I have not done a study ever. So, I'm so often I hear, oh, informed consents are no problem. And I have not once done a study that there wasn't a problem with informed consent. So at this point, I think every subject in every study needs to have their informed consent checked because it's such an important area. And I highlight here, any new investigator, you have a new investigator, doesn't matter if this is a phase 4 study, low risk, whatever, you need to check their informed consents until you're sure that they're doing it right. And anytime there's new staff at the site, you need to go back and check it again, because this is our commitment to research subjects, and it is absolutely critical that we make sure that it's done correctly. I also identified device trials, and I think a lot of times device trials, especially once post-marketing, these trials are done where people don't have a lot of experience with research as well. So the rate of informed consent errors is higher in device trials and drug trials when you go in and look at the data out of the audits from the FDA. But not just these. But if you have new investigators who haven't done research, your warning flags need to be going up, and you need to be able to see that they are doing it correctly. So remember, that is a tier 1 activity, or tier 1 or 2, whoever your monitor does it. But when you're looking at site performance, you're wanting to see, let's look at the rate of their errors, and is it going down to 0 the way it should? Because that is really giving you critical advice about good clinical practice. And that's why I have a little star here for the importance of the electronic investigator site files. So you are not protecting human subjects and their PHI when you fax informed consents to monitors. First of all, you have no documentation that they got it. You don't have a way to control that. That document is now out there for anybody to see. So it's much better for you to have an EISF, to be able to maintain that and keep those safe so that your investigator can see them. Now, we have a lot of site people on our training videos, which I think is awesome. So let's say you're a site staff or a site, and you want to do this kind of protection of your human subjects, and the sponsor doesn't do that, and they don't want to check it. One of the things you can do is you can have your own electronic investigator files for all your trials, and you can make those available to the site as to the monitor as well, because it's a protection for both of you to make sure your subjects are protected. Now, do training and documentation issues really belong in this overall site performance? And to me, I put them in here because I think they are an indication of whether the site is paying attention. It's trying to get at really important documentation. You're not going to review every document or things like that. So you really, really want to be thinking about, how is that information going to go in here and how am I going to use it? The reason I put it in, though, is when we had our eClinical Technologies webinar, we talked about 21 CFR Part 11. And a key part of 21 CFR Part 11 is control of access to your electronic systems and training and e-signature. So if you aren't paying attention to when the site makes errors in their training, when they don't let you know when someone has left, that you can control, removing access to that person, then those are really important issues from a 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. So again, question is, how are you going to capture this information? Whether you can do it as a query, that's one way. Maybe you can also do it as an issue log, or like we said, in our site level forms. But anytime you see staff turnover, so Susie left the site and Jane's coming in, automatically, red flag, we got to check this. And so looking at these kinds of indicators, and what you may want to do is just say, I'm going to look at site turnover as an indicator for me, because if I have a lot of site turnover, then I have a higher risk of having more documentation issues. And not just in training and access to systems, but whether it's a 1572 or whatever. So you could use as a surrogate here just site turnover. And that would automatically trigger high site turnover. I need to evaluate, going back deeper into whether these issues then become more important. So I'm going to take 1 second and see if we have any questions before we go on. No questions yet. So, okay. Don't forget to ask them if you want. And one other comment I forgot to make at the beginning is I will go through all the webinars. I'll take the questions that were asked that that have come up and that I think will be generalizable. And I will be sent. We'll put a document out or a little white paper out on that, so you'll have that. And then finally, let's look at this likes to jump. Investigational product management. Remember, one of those key areas. So let's look at things like rates of deviations for IP management. You want to think about not just dosing, but were there errors in randomization? Were there storage deviations? Were there deviations in return and reconciliation? All of these areas are important because remember, that's one of the top 5 important areas. So you do want to have some kind of review of IP, whether it's saying my trigger I'm going to look at is IP deviations, or maybe your deviations category can be IP and other, or something that will allow you to capture these deviations and better understand which are the sites that are having issues. Because these, I should have put my red flag here. This is a red flag. So it is really important to understand that and to know which are the sites that are having problems there. And then how will you evaluate? Oh, excuse me a minute. Where will the data come from and how will you capture the errors? So storage areas and reconciliation, again, site level deviations or an issues log. You want to think as you're planning this, where will I know if those things happen? Now, when you're reviewing data, you want to identify the outliers, like we said, as the first step. So whether it's the high and the low or just the high, doesn't matter. You just want to know for that specific report, which are the ones you're going to look at. You want to understand, is that a pattern? So remember the guy with the arrow in his head all the time. Are there other things going on? And then what was the root cause and how is the best intervention? So one other thing is just kind of a warning show, and I'll try to show this in some of the examples we're going to show, is that once a site has become an outlier, let's just think deviations. So let's just say they have more deviations and then you've corrected it, but now they still have that high number of deviations. So even if they've corrected over time, their rate may still be high. So you want to remember that, and you may want to look at deviations that occurred, by month when you're doing your central monitoring to really help you see, have those rates gone down? Have you started to see an improvement? So it's really important to realize that you can't just look at those pretty pictures and say, oh, see, their rate is continuing to be in the red space. That may be because once it's in the red space, it's going to stay there. And so you have to look at the data a little bit differently. So this is just a caveat for you when you're looking at that. So what I want to do now is to walk through a specific example. And this was presented by Peggy Seaman-Herchick at a DIA webinar we did in 2014. This was a phase 4 study that they did at ASI. And they implemented risk-based monitoring there. So what this is a specific example where a performance issue then occurred. So let's go through it. So the initiation visit was November 21st, no action. Then they started to see issues with the IRT or their IVR system. So that was in the December 11th and 12th. So they got a trigger right away in their randomization, and the site was called and emailed. So again, a little bit of a signal, is this important or not? Then in January, and this is why, remember we talked about you need to look at lots of different areas, because then by January, what they were seeing is that data entry lag. And remember we talked about that's really important here, because that was, first of all, you can't check the safety, but that was a very important warning signal for them. So when they had that, they couldn't assure this. They already had some issues here. They couldn't assure the safety because they weren't seeing the data. So they limited the screening to 1 per week for that site until they could see what happens. Then what they saw that a month later, that data lag still persisted. So they escalated it to the site management group, and they made the site stop enrollment. Now, how often do you see that happen that quickly? So the study started in November, and by February they were saying, we're concerned about this site. They can't enroll any more subjects until we straighten this out and make sure everything's okay. Okay? Then later that month, they again had done more evaluation, and they noticed a higher rate of premature discontinuation. So you remember, these are things we're looking at. These are all those little triggers we talked about. They didn't do anything else right then because they'd already halted enrollment. They didn't want to risk any more subjects being in the study. And then finally, in March, they began to uncover potentially some data issues, and they ordered a for-cause audit. Okay? Now, here's the early data where they began to see the issues. So let me walk you through here. These are the sites, okay? And the weight So this was a mean percent change from baseline. And it's by, here's your baseline, your visit 3, week 1, week 2, week 4, week 8, and then the end of the trial. Okay, so that's the purple one. And you can see here, this is the site they were worried about. And everybody else for these 2 visits were in the 3%, 2 to 5%, and this was 8 and 10%. So here you are, you already have an index of suspicion. Key efficacy endpoint. First of all, even if you just saw this would be a trigger for you, but now they had additional evidence here that they were looking at. So already a worrisome sign. And this, but one of the keys, and this is a really important one, because this was not a lot of data. So one of the things you can see, that this is 30, 22. So this can sometimes skew results, and that's important to realize, is that you've got to have an index of suspicion when you only have a little bit of data, because oftentimes it may turn out not to be an issue, and in this case, that was true. So once each of these other sites got similar numbers of subjects, their percentage was similar. They still had more, but they found that there really wasn't a data issue once they got more data. So this is important. Remember, you want to have an index of suspicion. That's what you're doing now, is you're a little bit like a detective. You're trying to find out what's real and what's not. So let's look at what they did. So when they found that first issue, they slowed that site down to 1 subject per week. And then once they saw more and more issues, they had the screening stopped. And then finally, they had the stat identify the issues. But they, so if this site had been able to continue to enroll, they would have had more subjects that would have been at risk. So again, if they'd used the stat data, then these number of subjects would have been at risk. But because they used the operational data, they say this is where they stopped that site from enrolling. So they stopped at 8, where if they had been going at their same projected rate, that site would have gone up to 20 subjects. So it would have put 12 more subjects at risk from GCP issues, etc., by not having this early warning signal. So this is this is showing a great way for you to see the really value to the quality of the data from the trial, but more importantly, to the subject safety. Because if you have questions about that site's performance, you have an index of suspicion, your first commitment is to the research subjects. So that's why we focus on that so much. And you can see by doing this, that savings of 12 subjects being at risk. So this was those operational screening, if they had waited for stats, it would have been much later. But because they found those signals, the site performance issues up front, they were able to protect those subjects and protect the integrity of the study as well. So excellent. Now, let's look at the results that they provided from this. So their operational data indicated GCP violations early. Great. Remember, we talked about early warning signals. The site had multiple issues. Another thing, remember, we talked about, don't just look at the arrow in the head. You want to look at everything, because if there's a little bit of an error or problem, there may be a bigger problem. So because they looked at everything, they were able to find other issues, and they were able to halt enrollment. And when they did a for cause audit, they were able to confirm that there were GCP issues. Now, from a statistical data, the earlier data indicated that the site data was different from the mean, but normalized as more data was accumulated. So once they started getting more data from the other sites, they were able to see that those data were not actually different. And so And when they did an audit, they did not identify any data issues. So the point is, sometimes there is, you think there might be an issue, but there isn't. But the big point is, look early, look thoroughly, and realize that sometimes some of your early signals may not in fact come through. But the fact that you've looked at it and you followed through is the whole idea behind risk-based monitoring. So early monitoring of the data should be considered with caution. So remember, if you start to see that the data look out of whack, you need to make sure to look at this over time. But the totality of that did say that because of those GCP issues, that it was important to go out this site and to be responsible and to look out for the subjects. So I think it was a beautiful example that they provided, again, in this webinar. And then I just wanted to take just a quick minute to walk through with you a little bit about, how you would look at this data and how you might be able to set this up. So this is a different tool, and this is the RBM risk indicators in JReview. And what we do up front is to set up the risk indicators, again, under these big categories. So these are the operational categories we have. And we can look at the number of screen failures, and we can set kind of a green range that says, oh, no problems. Then we can see that this site actually went up into the yellow range, but never into the red. And then we're back down in the green. Now, for their randomized subjects, you could see that they were in the green the whole time. So that was good. Remember, we wanted the high numbers are good for randomized subjects. And if we looked at the subject screen per month, we were able to see that they were in the range that you would expect them to see. But by doing this, you can look at the data over time, and then you can also compare data across subjects. So this is one way that allows you to look at multiple risk indicators together and then to compare them across sites. So again, you saw a little bit different pattern here, but the screen failures have gone way down. Again, you might expect some higher at the beginning, but they went back down. The randomized subjects, you can see that this site didn't enroll as many subjects and is right at the edge. So a site to watch where you didn't really need to watch that here. And the subject screen per month, again, they're not in the green, they're in the yellow, which probably explains why they're not having as many randomized subjects. So this data can tell you a lot. You can set this up, but one of the keys we want to do, and some of these programs are really nice, but sometimes you have to do some special programming to allow you to do the normalization of the data that we talked about. But these kinds of tools can, remember, do exactly what we talked about, and that is to give you your little key. So this is your little signal that whether there's an issue to worry about or not. And again, if they're in the green and yellow, you go, oh, okay, that area is not an area. Now let me look at AEs. Now let me look at these different classifications of risk, my basic site performance indicators. And finally, that is all that I'm going to do today on the site performance, and I want to do one final summary for you, and that is, as your take-homes from your 7 webinar series, is that hopefully that you remember that the risk assessment is the critical first step. So we absolutely, positively want to start with risk assessment. Now, if you do the risk assessment and you don't plan after that how you're going to look at it, then that's not enough. But you can't really effectively look at these information if you haven't done that risk assessment. So remember the risk assessment, and remember that risk-based monitoring is not high risk. Instead, It's a more focused evaluation of study data quality and subject safety for that matter. So what we want you're part of the evangelist group now, is to correct people's misperceptions. When they say, oh, I don't want to do that, it's risky, you're saying, oh, in contrary to that, it's really a much better way to look at the overall quality of the study. It's much more proactive. It's much more data driven. It's much more focused on the really, really important areas. So when we are able to give up most of our SDV, we now have the time to do this very important oversight that we cannot do um, on top of the SDV, but we really need to do this because it's going to be much more important to the overall quality. One of the questions I get all the time is, oh, I only do small studies, so I don't need risk-based monitoring. And I think if there's any message that we can take home to everyone who does risk-based monitoring, it's that, or who does clinical trials really, is that risk-based monitoring is a way of looking at the trial quality that is focused on the areas of highest risk. Should be done for every study. So if a subject is generous enough to participate in a research study, it's our responsibility to carefully assure that the quality is being done correctly, that the protocol is being followed, that we're doing the kind of oversight we need to do from the very smallest study to the very largest. So it's really important for people to understand that point. And I get asked that every week. So if you can help explain that to people, that's wonderful. I think it's the best way for you to advance your career and the clinical trial processes is to adopt RBM, the RBM process of evaluating performance. So I mentioned at the very beginning, this approach to quality oversight is not going away. And you've already shown that you are interested and committed to learning more about it. So you've already taken a huge step. So I recommend that you continue to learn in this area. We'll continue to provide content and realize that these are much, much better ways to look at data, to look at the trial quality than what you've traditionally seen. The next one is that technology can be your friend. So, many in clinical, say, oh, I'll just leave the technology to the data management group. And that is not the way you need to look at it. These tools and these reports can be useful and they can be helpful. And if you're having trouble understanding how to interpret the data, you're not stupid. You just need somebody to teach you how to do it. So once you've been taught how to do this, you will be able to understand why this is going to give you much more information. So technology is your friend, and it is not cost prohibitive. So remember that. There are ways to do it less expensively. We can help you if you need it, but you can find ways to do these without adding extra cost to your study. And finally, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So start somewhere. Take the first step. You don't have to get everything perfect. Remember that if you do your risk assessment, if you do a plan for how you're going to look at that, you've already made great progress over the traditional way that we do it. So I am here as a resource. MANA RBM is here as a resource. I thank you very much. And for the first time, we're actually done ahead of time. So if you do have questions, send them out to me. And I will be so sorry to miss seeing some of you that have sent us notes every time. You will be getting a survey after the webinar. Please fill it out. It really is going to help us to advance the training in RBM. Things that you want to learn, things that if there's anything we can do to improve it, tell us, because remember, risk-based monitoring is all about improving quality, learning what you didn't do as well, doing it better. And we absolutely positively want to do that. And so please provide that information to us. It'll help us do a much better job going forward. And I want to thank you all for your participation and your nice emails. And I'll look forward to seeing you. Excuse me. Next month. So take care. Bye bye.